So, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the Austrian economists, and um, it's a little bit difficult, at least from the outset, to kind of understand these three individuals that are kind of like the fathers of Austrian economic thought. That would be von Mises, von Hayek, and Schumpeter. The Austrian economists um, are to many not much different than neoclassical economists. But if you ask a Austrian if they're neoclassical, they probably reject it. Now, the reason why um, someone like myself, who is not an Austrian, someone like myself views the Austrians as just slightly different neoclassicals is because both groups, the Austrians and the neoclassicals, focus on marginalism, meaning that the idea that optimal decisions are made at the margin. And since both Austrians and neoclassicals believe this, and it is central to the way that they understand their perspective on the world, that's why someone like myself doesn't see them as that much different. But what would an Austrian like von Mises, von Hayek, or Schumpeter say? Um, well, the biggest thing would be is that they just have very different tools. A standard neoclassical economist, if you were to encounter them, focuses a great deal on predictive methods and use of upper level mathematics, whereas the Austrians really focus on history. Quite a few of them. I mean, I go to these history of economic thought conferences, and it's just filled to the brim with Austrians. Um, and the Austrians also focus on disequilibrium situations rather than equilibrium situations that the neoclassicals focus on. So, with all that said, let's kind of now that I've kind of set the stage, let's get into um, the Austrians. So Karl Menger is largely seen as the founder of the Austrian school. And then in the 1800s, we then have Bombewerk, von Wieser. And then in the more modern era, the 1900s, we have von Mises, von Hayek, and Schumpeter, the individuals that we had at the very top of this. Um, Menger is a little bit different. Karl Menger, right? Because his focus was with the marginalists and those early neoclassicals. That's why Austrians and neoclassicals are sort of, for many, lumped together. But what someone like Menger would say is that, that idea of like marginal utility, optimal decisions made at the margin, whereas for the neoclassicals, it was essential. Menger would argue that it's not critical to the building of their field. Um, Someone like Menger focused a great deal more, again, on these disequilibrium situations, or again, whereas neoclassicals focus on equilibrium. But additionally, Menger, as an Austrian, focused on institutions and institutional traditions, whereas neoclassicals don't really think anything about institutions. Um, and again, you have the differences in the tools. Whereas Menger did promote a focus on history because of that idea that you're looking for deeper forces and essential causes, and the tool would be history. Neoclassicals don't have very much use for history. I say that as a historian of economic thought. Rather, neoclassicals obviously focus on mathematical formalism. And so it is because Austrians have that historical view towards institutions that makes them a bit what we would call heterodox. Again, that would be basically anything other than neoclassicals, but in its strictest sense, neoclassicals would probably think Austrians are just really a part of them. We saw this discussion of the importance of institutions when we looked at Veblen. So you're starting to see the connections here too, again, between the various kinds of economists. For um, for Veblen, you understand the world, you understand economic forces best when you look at it through the lens of history, and and they pretty much do believe that past is prologue, meaning that past history shapes future events and shapes institutions. The Austrians as well focus on individuals, and that these individuals are engaged in purposeful activities, meaning they just pursue various goals. And because the Austrian cares a great deal about coordination, institutions are important to them, not only because it promotes this understanding of history, but also because institutions are the representation of individuals pursuing their goals in a joint situation. Okay, so when we think about what defines the Austrians and their approach to economics, now outside of this, we already said that again, there's this focus on marginalism. But again, the three things I think we could largely agree for Austrians is that they understand themselves as engaged in purposeful action, meaning that they act in a way to achieve certain goals. And so this differs a bit from the neoclassicals, who would just see themselves as focusing on pleasure maximization or pain minimization. The Austrian economist as well, again, focuses on this idea of the individual rather than this kind of summation that a neoclassical does to achieve the aggregates. And then again, finally, that the Austrians do focus a great deal on relationships, and that these relationships are basically seen as we look at things historically. So what that means then is that there's less of a focus on mathematism and seeing economics as a science. So let's start with von Mises. Von Mises was influenced by Menger. Menger, again, being kind of the very first Austrian economist slash neoclassical. Von Mises left Germany during World War II. He escaped the Nazis and he became a visiting professor at NYU. And a great deal of the reason of why von Mises became influential pretty quickly is that he had a lot of money. And that's the thing about Austrians that exists even to this day, is that Austrians are incredibly well funded because many of their beliefs promote the interest of those in business. And so von Mises is no different. He was funded incredibly well by Lawrence Fertig. And then Mises was also a founding member of the Mont Pelerin Society, which exists to this day. I once attended for, what was it, 2-week Austrian economics seminar. Now, again, I'm not an Austrian, but I took a 2-week, immersion in this. And I guess one of the highlights was I did get to meet Murray Rothbard, who was kind of one of the last Austrian economists in this great tradition. All I can say about those 2 weeks is that they're just incredibly well funded, incredibly well funded. Um, and that money is all coming, generally speaking, from the private sector, from businesses providing them funding. Now, NYU today is not a large place where Austrian economics is practiced. Now, what's interesting about this, right? So, as we focused on Friedman and talking about a distinct school called the Chicago School of Economics, which would be at the University of Chicago, Austrians today, you would see them either at undergraduate specific institutions like Hillsdale or Grove City College, both of these, Hillsdale being in Michigan, Grove City being in Pennsylvania. But if you wanted to like study Austrian economics at the graduate level, then you likely would go to George Mason University, which is pretty much the leading location of where Austrians hang out in their free time. Now, von Mises, one of the innovations or one of his focus was looking at this theory of money. And so, whereas we see today this idea that we see Menger in our neoclassical texts when we focus on this idea that money solves problems that exist in a barter economy, and that the problem of a barter economy is that it's just incredibly wasteful. There's a double coincidence of wants where you have to find individuals that each want the thing that the other is offering. In this case, right, for Menger, you get a pretty clear description that you would have things like gold, a mutually acceptable thing, whether it be fiat or commodity-based money, but you have something that's widely accepted, and that becomes one of the key features of what money does, right? That's a unit of count, store of value, and a medium of exchange. And that medium of exchange would be this idea that it's widely accepted. Now, the question, though, would be, is what determines the value of money? So for von Mises, the value of money comes from two different sources. Money has both an objective exchange value as well as a subjective use value. In the objective exchange value, what we're talking about here is the purchasing power of the money. How much value can it be used? How much money is required to purchase things of value? Now, money also, though, has a subjective use value. And that would be because it allows you to purchase these other goods. So he does this von Mises does this in his text, Theory of Money and Credit. Now, when we look at this objective exchange value, what we're looking at here is the money stable or not, right? How much of it is being destroyed, for instance, by this amount of inflation? And if you'll notice here, most of these questions right here, we actually only started measuring that in the 1940s when we started to measure what is, what is inflation, right? And that inflation is that diminishment of the purchasing power of money. And we see that emerge again when we look at the quantity theory of money, right? And we look at the overall price level and how it's changing. Now, what we see as we start to look at the quantity theory of money, and we look at how it measures the prices. The problem is that when we understand the money supply changing. The problem that we face is that all prices are seen as rising in the same proportion. Now, what we have, though, is something called the Cantillon effect. And in the Cantillon effect, what we're saying is that that prices could vary relative to each other. And so if prices vary relative to each other, then what we would want to have is something that allows us to measure those variations. Those variations would be measured with some knowledge about what the utility preferences are. And so that those differing levels of utility that attach to different goods would generate different prices. So then we have to go to the individual, which is not something, again, that the neoclassical is going to do. They're focused entirely on the aggregate. So for an Austrian like Mises, you want to look at how that valuation through marginal utility is done at the individual level to understand those relative price differences. Now, what you also would want to do is you'd want to track how money moves through the system. If you remember, someone like Friedman had said that money was neutral, that it had no effect on equilibrium in the economy. For Mises, though, what we see is that money was not neutral. That Mises at the time, he didn't escape Germany until 1940. And so he was there to observe the hyperinflation that existed in the interwar period under Hitler. And he saw that those who kind of anticipated the hyperinflation first, had more power, had more wealth by getting things early and getting out of the German Deutschmark during the interwar period. So he does see that power and influence and wealth, in this case, went to those who participated in it earlier. And then when you change the money supply, which is what the Germans did in the interwar period, and thus, when they changed the money supply, which causes the change in the value, then there are these somewhat random redistributions of prosperity between different groups, depending on what their utility preferences are and how early they are in the system to receiving the benefits of that increased money supply. Okay, pause here. Now, what the Austrians realized, though, is that, if you're looking at these changes in the relative prices based on individuals and the marginal utility they attach to things, it's going to get pretty difficult to do that. There'd be a lot of data required to do that. And so Murray Rothbard, again, that's probably about the one of the few economists in this era. He died shortly after I met him, but he gave up on it. He didn't see it as that important. So when he wrote Man, Economy, and the State, he didn't really look too deeply into kind of the flow of money. But this was maybe more of a this was maybe more something that Mises was interested in because of Friedman's focus on it. Now, the other side to this is that, if you want to look at things like how important the purchasing power of money is, someone like Hayek just didn't think that that spending too much time on the purchasing power of money, it doesn't do a great deal for you to understand the consequences of a monetary system. For someone like Hayek, it's actually more important to look again at this when you rapidly change the money supply, which we would call the monetary shock. How does that cause this unequal distribution of wealth and power in the system? Okay, so um, for someone like Mises, um, again, Mises is a little bit different than someone like Rothbard in that, um, Mises again was focusing on the subjective use value, looking at how individuals um, care about the marginal utility that they attach to something. Um, but the other problem, though, that Mises faced when he did this is that there was a problem of circularity, and that would be because the value of the money would depend on the price of the goods that it could purchase. So there's a circularity that makes things a little bit more difficult to understand, and it breaks down the connection then between the value of the money and the marginal utility of the goods themselves. Um, I'm not sure I need to say much more about this circularity problem. I think it's pretty self-evident. So I'm just gonna just to keep this lecture not too long, because this one's got a few more slides than the others. Um, to get around the circularity problem, Mises created something he called the regression theorem. And this had to do with this idea that um, people form expectations about the future purchasing power of money based on their memory of what the purchasing power was in the immediate past. Um, and so that basically there's this connection between the points in time going forwards and backwards, and that you don't necessarily, um, you know, get to do that as closely. You get to do that much more easily in a monetary system than in a barter system. You can still somewhat do it in a barter system, but really only more so once you have the emergence of a commodity backed money, such as a gold standard, because then you can understand that purchasing power of the gold rather than a straight barter system. Um, for the Austrians, what they're focusing on as well is this idea that, whereas Friedman would focus on the money supply as changing the overall economy, what someone like Mises would say is yes, that matters. But what also matters is the uh, so for Mises, these Cantillon distribution effects become important because again, it's this weird random um, way in which wealth and power are redistributed based on shocks, increases in the money supply. Um, what we see as well with Mises is this idea that um, these redistributions of the power and the wealth, um, these reallocations are really not based on what people wanted. These reallocations are not permanent, but they do last a pretty long time. And these reallocations themselves can lead to further economic crises, which becomes important for the Austrians because that's another kind of focus of theirs is to focus on these points of time where there's a disequilibrium. where we want to have an understanding of um, uh, the cause of a crisis. Now, Hayek, when he's emerging as an economist, you have to remember that again, one of the things that was being done, and this was again at the time of Keynes, was trying to better understand the business cycle. Now, Friedman was doing it, and you also had Keynes doing it, but Hayek is going to be a third individual doing it. And what he did is he read, he was a student of Mises. He read Mises's text, Socialism. And Hayek wrote a book that became incredibly famous called The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944. And the argument here was that fascism develops out of socialism. And it's obviously different than the Marxian understanding where socialism emerged out of capitalism. So Hayek ends up 1950 going to the University of Chicago, where Friedman was at as well. And in 1974, Hayek wins the Nobel Prize in Economics. So you're already seeing here, too, this kind of centralization of importance for the University of Chicago, at least for the Austrians, Friedman, and it's more of this conservative angle for the economist. I mean, it is a great deal where conservative style economics is practiced today. And it's been that way for the past 75 years. So Hayek is important because what he helps build is this Austrian theory of the business cycle. And the essential belief is that any government intervention, that business cycles are largely caused by government intervention. Because what government intervention does is it disrupts individual plans and the way in which individuals are coordinated with each other. That basically, if you let individuals coordinate on their own and react to market incentives, then business cycles wouldn't exist, at least as deeply. So anytime you get monetary or fiscal intervention, then you get a growth path for the economy that becomes unsustainable and it becomes disruptive. Okay, so we can ignore. Originally, I was going to make this where I went through the graphs and whatnot, but at least in the textbook and even what you're responsible for, you're not going to have to do that. So I'm just going to skip over a part of this here. What that does, though, for us is it gets us to a closer understanding then of why the money supply is so important. Hayek, like Friedman, believes that the money supply should be kept under pretty firm control because, again, anytime there's government intervention or monetary policy intervention, the economy is damaged. The business cycles are heightened. For Friedman, what we had was this kind of rule where monetary policy was driven by kind of a rules-based agenda. And really, Hayek's not that different. What he understood was that, it's really difficult to kind of fine-tune the money supply to achieve a certain economic outcome. And so because it's so difficult to, fine-tune an economy, it's probably best to just have a firm rule that's followed or no intervention at all. And perhaps the easiest way to manage the money supply would be with a return to the gold standard. So that was kind of Hayek's first idea, is that if we just return to the gold standard, then we know that the money supply wouldn't change that much unless gold went missing or unless new gold sources became discovered. What Hayek really didn't like was the way in which the government influenced the money supply. And he didn't think that, in terms of fiat currencies, where the government kind of basically dictates that a single currency be used for everything, Hayek didn't like this idea of a government establishing a monopoly over let's say, for instance, in the United States, over the use of a dollar as a fiat currency. He would have been in favor of a commodity-based currency or commodity-based money, such as the gold standard or even the silver standard. Working with Hayek is Schumpeter. So Schumpeter, he emerges out of Austria, just like our other characters here, um, uh, taught largely by von Bavarik, um, gets his PhD at, again, the time that the early Austrians are just emerging. Now he has a bit more of an exciting past. While he was the Austrian Minister of Finance for a while, he was also the financial advisor to a princess in Egypt. Um, like Mises, fled the Nazis and went off to Harvard and uh, he's kind of a funny guy. Schumpeter had at one point said that his three ambitions were to be a great lover, a great horseman, and a great economist. Um, he cited, though, that his two major intellectual influences were Walras, obviously the noted um, neoclassical, as well as Marx. Now, Schumpeter is probably best known for history of economic analysis, as well as capitalism, socialism, and democracy. The Schumpeter text I have is the Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. That's the one that's on my bookshelf right now, meaning I've read most of it. And again, this is all coming at the time again of Keynes, and we're getting the 1930s, 1940s was such an interesting period because this is really where you have neoclassical economics being reconsidered, just because the Great Depression had shaken everyone's faith in things. And so you really have this active debate between the Austrians, the monetarists, um, uh, and the Keynesians. Schumpeter, the way that you see him in today's Principles of Economics textbook is with a chapter that focuses on the entrepreneur. And that the entrepreneur is seen as this person that's different than the capitalist, different than the landowner, different than the laborer. What they do is that they act like a technology almost, in the sense that they form new combinations. They find that they're innovative in a way that others of us don't see. So it's kind of like Shark Tank-ish, right? That, what is an entrepreneur? Someone who's able to see new products, new services, new ways of doing things, and that you need that innovation in order to move the economy forward with this idea of creative destruction. Right. And so you watch any episode of Shark Tank and you see exactly these bullet points, right? That all of these people are generally doing at least one of these bullet points. It really is true. Um, Schumpeter, we lump him in as a Austrian because he does focus on these points of disequilibrium, and that what the entrepreneur does is creates these disequilibriums, these disjoint points when they introduce a new product or they disrupt the monopoly, et cetera, et cetera. So disruptions, disturbances, these are all caused by the entrepreneur who profits from, has a role in creating this disruption. Disruption, again, is a good thing. It makes the economy resilient. It makes the economy one where it can develop with a stronger, more stable growth, and hopefully achieve a new equilibrium even faster. But again, the purpose of an entrepreneur is to create the disequilibrium, which again, that entrepreneur eventually gets replaced by another entrepreneur. And so when we look for these examples of creative destruction, I mean, we can just look through history and we see it, right? We can, the Xerox copier, which today would not be that destructive or that creative, at what time was, as was the Polaroid camera, as were even railroads, right? And you can follow this, right? 8-track tapes, to cassette tapes, to compact discs, to MP3 players, to online streaming, right? And you can see again that it's basically, an inventor who comes up with things, but then they, replace it, right? A new technology replaces what a previous entrepreneur did. I mean, even look at the second bullet point, second to last bullet point. Netflix gets rid of the videotape and disc rental industry, but then what replaces Netflix? Well, it's these. I mean, the things that exist today would be there's like these, if you don't have a cable TV subscription like YouTube TV, there's things like Tubi and Pluto, and it's basically these like online cable stations that are free of charge, but they have all these ads, and that kind of, in some sense, seeks to displace even Netflix. Email and texting displace fax machines. What displaces email and texting? Well, like Instagram and other things like that displaces that all. So again, we're constantly seeing that displacement. We're constantly seeing that creative destruction that's caused by entrepreneurs. And what that disruption does, what that innovation does, is it creates temporary, and that's a key word here, temporary market power and profit. If you watch any episode of Shark Tank, of which I've seen a few episodes, almost all of those people who are buying it aren't in it for the long run. No, they're just in it long enough to sell it to some other company. They don't have any desire to be a long-term owner of these things. Why? Because the profit will exist for only a short period of time. And what we see here is that, new industries emerge as these innovations occur. But what also happens is that new product eventually becomes an old product, and then is basically replaced by a further innovation. Now, what comes from creative destruction? Unemployment, right? But in this case, for economists like Schumpeter, unemployment is a good thing. What kind of unemployment would this be? This would be structural unemployment, where people become unemployed because their industry is changing, right? I mean, the one right now that we are all living in right now is this whole idea of artificial intelligence, right? It is, if you think about what Google's model was all about, right? It was about having a search engine and selling ads with that search engine, right? And people would basically find answers to questions using the search engine, right? Today, ChatGPT, is basically a replacement to a Google search, right? And in this case, ChatGPT is delivering them the answers without giving them a flurry of all the, different sources that one would have to look through to kind of come up with something. That's going to lead to unemployment, though, right? Because for someone like myself in the industry of knowledge creation, I mean, artificial intelligence, I would imagine at some point would replace professors, or at least a good deal of them. Will I become structurally unemployed? Well, I'm kind of getting old enough that I probably am kind of hoping I can ride it out. But if I were like 20 years younger, I'd actually be a lot more scared. Um, so again, this is kind of the paradox of creative destruction. While you want to have the innovation to make the economy stronger, it does mean that some individuals are going to be worse off, possibly in the long run, right? So creative destruction here would be AI will replace people's jobs. I wrote a book review on artificial intelligence, and they were trying to look at what will be the jobs that are replaced. Yeah, I mean, the first jobs that are going to be replaced is, things where like coding and whatnot, where AI can relatively quickly code things. And so now you don't need that kind of low level programmer to do it. Um, Now, the issue that Schumpeter has with capitalism, and the reason why he's a bit concerned that capitalism is in decline, is that you know innovation is being taken in house. So right, so companies form like research and development teams, and they try to develop new technologies so that they can control the creative destruction within the business itself, right? The classic example of that, or a famous example of that, would be, that Xerox, right, the maker of the photocopier machine, had done basically a good deal of this kind of point and click technology that we use on computers today. And that Steve Jobs for Apple Computer stole the technology that Xerox PARC had developed internally in its research and development lab. But the problem is that a lot of the disruptiveness, right? It's hard for it to be celebrated when it's within a corporate structure where individuals want or companies want to profit from it. And when you routinize that innovation, the again, you're not going to see a great deal of disruption. Um, what you so right, so first we have that obsolescence of the entrepreneurial function. The entrepreneurism is basically internalized in many companies. Second is that businesses keep getting bigger and bigger. So capitalism is being destroyed, at least according to Schumpeter, because big businesses are absorbing smaller businesses. And so we're seeing less and less um, competition. And that we look within even in the structure of a company, and we see that we're getting these individuals like the managers, the salaried executives, and the large stockholders, um, you know, that have a great incentive to not have innovation, to keep the system the way that it is. They have a vested interest in things. And then third, what we see is that the government isn't promoting, at least for Schumpeter, that the government isn't promoting capitalism, because what they do is they impose high taxes, they make public investments, they legislate the use of labor, and they regulate big businesses, and they stop them, from doing certain things. And so, because the government is spending money and it's making decisions for investment, that undermines entrepreneurship and it destroys the economy. Um, Now, at the same time, State capitalism at least does allow for some preservation of human values that could possibly be lost under other systems, um, a fascist kind of system. And again, you have to remember that, again, that would be sort of the legacy um, of Schumpeter having escaped the Nazis, much like Mises did. So how do we throw all three of these together and kind of understand where we're going here? Is that when we look at the current state of economics today, right, is that the Austrians are still a pretty strong school of economics, as is the Chicago School of Economics. And those are largely the two places where if you wanted to do innovative work in a kind of pro-market capitalist environment, again, you'd go to George Mason or University of Chicago, and you will still find the Chicago School of Economics and the Austrians competing against the modern monetarists that are over at University of Missouri, Kansas City, versus everybody else. And what is the everybody else? Well, it's kind of a blend of neoclassicism with some elements of Keynesianism, with some elements of Austrian. And so the modern theory that, someone like myself trained in, I got my PhD in 2005, the modern monetarists were there, they were present, but we didn't really get a lot of training in it because it was such a new school of thought. But it largely was a kind of a mix of Austrians, Keynesians, neoclassicals, even a little bit of institutionalists. So that the modern thing that we're taught today is that kind of potpourri, this kind of mix and match of various things.